But before we come to a closing and addressing the additional arrests and what it all essentially means with the end result of the 9/11 Commission report, there's still one other news archive source that we can sometimes rely on, and that's C-SPAN. So if we return back to September 18th during Ashcroft's daily briefing at the FBI, where 75 people were already detained on immigration charges, as well as the 4 material witnesses, plus the 200 suspects authorities are reportedly looking for, a reporter also asked Ashcroft in reference to all those suspects detained within the first week, wanting to know if they were going to be considered enemy combatants, which would therefore allow investigative authorities to hold these suspects indefinitely.
Suspects be considered prisoners of war? Are you assuming wartime powers in any way?
Ashcroft answered with a flat-out,
no.
Thank you.
But there's a lot to unpack here, considering what sort of ideal investigation most Americans wanted and expected after 9/11. Regardless of how enraged or ill-informed most of us were in the beginning, seeking revenge and full of bloodlust in that Operation Enduring Freedom, going after the Taliban and bombing Afghanistan, seemed justified. But yet there were also follow-up attempts of hijackings and other attacks in small portions that continued onward after 9/11 in the following month and year, that also fell in sync with the constant state of fear and federal terror threat assessments, often later discarded as false alarms, some of them having to do with anthrax letters, which was also allocated as a different law enforcement matter and case, which is a subject that could be made into a film by itself, as it has yet been in books and literature. But some of these detainee suspects were even American-born citizens and had lived in the U.S. prior, just like John Walker Lind, captured as an enemy combatant during Operation Enduring Freedom in the invasion of Afghanistan in November of 2001, but no link or association to the 9/11 attacks was ever proven. Then there's Jose Padilla, born in Brooklyn, who was arrested at Chicago O'Hare Airport coming from Pakistan in May 2002, and was plotting to set off a dirty bomb in Chicago. Neither him was ever combined or charged in the 9/11 conspiracy, even though the September 11th attacks were something clearly planned years in advance. Not even Anwar al-Awlaki, born in New Mexico of Yemeni ancestry, who was seen here just days after 9/11, interviewed in a report in Virginia on hate crimes and vandalism carried out at the mosque he held sermons at. He was never picked up or detained, when years later it's revealed he had numerous al-Qaeda links, and even associated with 2 of the hijackers of Flight 77, the plane that struck the Pentagon, both in San Diego and Virginia. Instead, he's eventually killed in a drone strike by the Obama administration 10 years later in 2011. The bottom line is that no American citizen was ever charged in being involved in the 9/11 plot. But considering what suspects do get filtered in the immediate FBI dragnet, or ultimately charged for masterminding and aiding the 9/11 conspiracy, is mainly Zacarias Moussaoui, who was already arrested in August 2001 for INS charges in Minnesota, and is now serving time at Supermax Prison, Colorado, with other past al-Qaeda conspirators. But separate from Moussaoui, those as 9/11 conspirators later caught overseas end up mainly being held in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, where some of them go through torturous interrogations, like waterboarding, packaged to the public as enhanced interrogation techniques. And questions remain still if those controversial techniques were necessary, or effective at all, and for what purposes. And then there's the question if some of the Gitmo detainees were even guilty at all of any wrongdoing pertaining to 9/11, since there are a few cases where some have been released, including others held in secret detention facilities overseas, often called CIA black sites. Not to mention the slow and agonizing process it's taken to charge some of these Gitmo detainees, who very well may be guilty. But as Human Rights Watch focuses on their conditions, it also brings to attention that some of the detainees' tribunals have yet to take place. And then there's also the unresolved matter or questions regarding how the German government handled all the Hamburg cell and associates, being that they are labeled as the official ringleaders of the 9/11 conspiracy. Why are some of the Hamburg members free or never charged of anything to do with 9/11? And why no suspects were handed over to American authorities and Gitmo or other detention centers? But in regards to whether George W. Bush was considering anyone held within the PENTTBOM investigation INS detainees as prisoners of war, therefore using wartime powers which would have enabled federal agents to conduct a thorough investigation, having these suspects held indefinitely rather than under limitations of immigration and naturalization laws, should be a major signal now when looking at it through Ashcroft, in that the Bush administration was not serious about investigating the 9/11 attacks at all, but instead were illegitimately focused on Iraq, even though most Americans would have been okay with enhanced interrogations being used on these immediate detainees, so long as it was publicly clear that they were suspects and it was an overwhelming number. It means that most of the public would not have immediately objected to such torture techniques on abundant, relevant suspects, rather than wait years later to be used on a few questionable Gitmo detainees during an already now era of great mistrust and skepticism over the attacks. Because with the PENTTBOM dragnet and INS detainees first apprehended to have been 9/11 suspects, the number reached up to 700 to 1,200 detainees, depending on which source. Some have said as wide as a range of 2,000 detainees, but that ultimately many of them were freed because of initially being picked up under false profiling by authorities as either foreigners or Muslims. Attorney and author Steve Brill, in his book, After, The Rebuilding and Defending of America in the September 12th Era, notes, the Bush administration knew that the attacks had come from Muslims, so without any better leads, why not just question any such men you could, and hold those who it turned out were violating the terms of their visas? Had they taken jobs? Had they overstayed their visas? They would then be detained for immigration violation and questioned repeatedly. It didn't matter if the violations were minor transgressions for which immigrants of other nationalities are rarely, if ever, held. The goal, Ashcroft and Chertoff told the FBI and INS agents, was to prevent more attacks, not prosecute anyone, and the best way to do that with the roundup, question, and hold as many people as possible. Referring back to the book Detained Without Cause, Muslim Stories of Detention and Deportation in America After 9/11 by Irum Sheikh. In the introduction, Patterns of Post-9/11 Detentions, that does give a decent formal breakdown pertaining to the immediate scale with the dragnet for her subjects in her book. It says, the term 9/11 detentions refers to cases of individuals from predominantly Muslim countries who were arrested after 9/11 on suspicion of terrorism, but were held under unrelated immigration or criminal charges. Immigration officers categorize these individuals as special interest cases because of their suspected involvement with the 9/11 attacks. The total number of 9/11 detentions is unknown because of the secrecy surrounding these cases. But 2 months after the attacks occurred, government officials acknowledged that 1,182 individuals had been detained for questioning. Later, the government stopped releasing the total number of detentions because of the complications in counting, even though detentions of the individuals and connection with the 9/11 attacks continued after the release of the initial figure. The Office of Inspector General, OIG, report defines 911 detainees as aliens held on immigration violations in connections with the investigation of September 11th attacks. Of the roughly 1,200 aforementioned cases, the report focuses on 762 individuals arrested for immigration violations between September 11, 2001 and August 6, 2002. And following that, under 9/11 detainees demographics, the OIG report provides a demographic breakdown of the 762 special interest cases, including in its analysis, most of the individuals are from predominantly Muslim countries, such as Pakistan, Egypt, Turkey, Jordan, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Tanzania, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, Algeria, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan. The demographic breakdown also identified British and French citizens, most of whom were naturalized citizens originally from countries such as Pakistan, Egypt, and Algeria. The Human Rights Watch report presents a similar demographic breakdown, which showed that most of the special interest cases came from Pakistan, Egypt, and Turkey. 33% of the 762 individuals were Pakistani. This is an interesting revelation, being that the 9/11 attacks are mainly thought of harmoniously as a Saudi conspiracy, with bin Laden a Saudi citizen, and that 15 of the 19 hijackers were also Saudis. But as known with some cases of Pakistani intelligence funding, the Khalid Sheikh Mohammed family lineage, as well as what we've pointed out, there's good reason to suspect aborted Pakistani operatives, as we should also be reminded with the cases before 9/11, such as Nayaz Khan, who was a Pakistani hijacking operative that turned himself in to the FBI in 2000, claiming that he was supposed to be involved in a future terrorist attack mission. Some early newspaper reports in November were also giving a number under nationalities, and some were not avoiding the number of Israeli detainees either. And from the U.S. Department of Justice, Office of Inspector General, OIG, in a 239-page document called A Review of Treatment of Aliens Held on Immigration Charges in Connection with the Investigation of September 11th Attacks from 2003, its chart confirms this high percentage of Pakistanis, while also reveals the percentage of other nationalities. But take notice that the nationalities coming out of India, Yemen, Jordan, Turkey were all greater numbers than those who were detained as Saudi nationals. Yet Egyptians were second greatest number of suspects, nearly quadrupled the amount of Saudis, which shouldn't be surprising being that the predominant number of conspirators charged in the first attack on the Twin Towers during the 1993 World Trade Center bombing were from Egypt, which is another good reason why the first attack on the Twin Towers needs further exploring, which you can see in one of my recent films, World Trade Center bombing of 1993, Hidden Path to 9/11, Crimes, Cover-Ups, and Missing Links. For those who have been in denial of 9/11 being a grand conspiracy with hundreds to 1,000 people involved, regardless if truth seekers' only pursuit is all the speculations regarding what entirely brought down the Twin Towers, still, there you have it. Within just the number within the OIG list as an argument and foundation to start with. And as just mentioned, included in the OIG report are some Israeli nationals. However, it does not list the reported over 200 Israelis that were detained and let go before September 11, 2001. This is why it's even crucial for 9/11 truth seekers still looking at only Israeli involvement and foreknowledge cannot ignore or absolve any of the suspected Arab or fundamentalist involvement, which are also areas easier to prove state sponsorship. And regardless of what raw or incomplete chain of evidence lacking from all the officials, there is no need to tolerate substitution for such obvious hijacker roles by fantastical and empty claims as direct orchestration or collusion with the U.S. military and government. With Fox News' Carl Cameron, who does report about the Israeli spy ring in December of 2001, ranging as high as 200 suspects arrested before and after 9/11, is a vindication by controversy to look at, but is an angle that's a limited scope. And also consider months later in 2002, what is still continually reported after, underlining the operations as art students, likely all living near the hijacker or terrorist cells throughout major cities. It is a damning enough public indictment that they could have alerted authorities and prevented the attacks. But it seems, as many can speculate, wasn't within these Israelis' conscience or modus operandi. But without having to know the total OIG arrest statistics, those within the camp of Israeli suspicions and accusations know that there was a huge number of arrests given some kind of diplomatic immunity with Israelis being detained, which was a great difference of treatment compared to those foreigners labeled as Arab Muslims or other, as the Israelis were only held up to 60 days, 2 months at the Metropolitan Detention Center before being deported. And chronologically speaking, also consider the timing of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's first public interview along with Ramzi bin al-Shibh for Yossi Fruda of Al Jazeera being in April 2002. This is when KSM decided to take credit for the attacks, having already been filtered to an official scale of 4 hijacked planes and 19 hijackers. KSM never stated that he was the head of the Al-Qaeda military committee, and yet with all the controversial circumstances to how many times he had been waterboarded, tortured, and inconsistencies to crimes he's allegedly confessed to, along with what has been made public from it, KSM's alleged confessions are basically there to reaffirm the official scale of the commission report, and that they were only capable of hijacking 4 planes, and that there was no use of explosives, neither within the hijacking takeover, even though passenger calls made from 2 of the flights stated the contrary, that the hijackers did have bombs. The basic confession of KSM is that 9/11 was simply inspired by the Bojinka plot, and that they can only manage 4 hijackings is simply laughable on its face, not just because of what we've entirely laid out through this film, but because when the Bojinka plot was discovered in Manila in 1995, it was clear to Philippines Police Colonel Rodolfo Mendoza, who looked through all the evidence and interrogated Abdul Hakim Murad, associate of Ramzi Youssef, that there was already pilots training in the U.S. for the plan, aside from what other suspects were also rounded up in the Philippines still and in preceding years. But separate from questioning what was really planned, in what could be considered the buildup of 9/11 with the Millennium Plot during the 2000 Years Day celebration, the other reason why it's a naive idea to think that 9/11 was simply Bojinka inspired, limited to 4 planes, is also the case of the 2006 transatlantic aircraft plot, where terrorists planned to detonate liquid explosives carried on board 10 airliners traveling from the UK to the US and Canada, disguised as soft drinks. The plot was discovered by British police during an extensive surveillance operation. So it would be absurd to think that they were only capable of coordinating a dozen planes years before and after 9/11 2001, rather than just in 2001. Not to mention that with the transatlantic plot, it also reaffirms that there was a central higher command than KSM and family already in prison.